So, my name is Glenn Corbett. I'm an associate professor here at John Jay College. I'm also a board member of the Christian Reaganhart Center for Emergency Response Studies, also called RaCERS. And today I have with me two esteemed colleagues here and really impressive career type folks here, the Wallaces, and I just asked them quickly to give their background, and you'll see why this is going to be an interesting segment. So,
okay,
Deborah?
I'm Deborah Wallace. Although I'm retired now, I had been president of Public Interest Scientific Consulting Service. We did a lot of the fire epidemiology work between 1975 and 1995.
I'm Rodrick Wallace. I'm presently a research scientist in the Division of Epidemiology at the New York State Psychiatric Institute with Columbia University. And I, too, spent some years looking at fire service data using techniques from population, community, ecosystem ecology to understand what happened to the city in the 1970s and the consequences.
So thank you both for being here today. It's an honor to have you here. Again, two individuals who have set the mark very high for all of us in terms of their research, and particularly in our area, the research into fire service effectiveness and its relationship to the cities in which the fire departments serve. I'd like to open up because to talk about issues of let's go back to the 1970s and 1960s and talk about how fire played a very large role here in the city. We know that, of course, historically that the 1970s was the period in which the number of responses by the fire department in New York was the highest it's ever been before or since. And a large part of that was due to the arson epidemic that was happening at that time. So do you want to talk about, in general, about the ecological dynamics, we'll call them, of urban fire and what was going on back then, and maybe perhaps what even drew you to that issue? So,
First of all, I'm sorry, I have to correct you, although
Yes.
you're an associate professor.
No, and I know I used the word epidemic of arson, didn't I?
It's not arson.
Right.
It
That's
was-
what. See, this is exactly why I had you
It
come on here,
was
because I want you to get right
all
to the heart
fires.
of it. Right.
We looked at stacks of fire reports from high fire neighborhoods, West Harlem, Bushwick, Crown Heights, and what we saw was that the great majority of fires had ordinary causes,
Right.
the cooking fires, the flinging the cigarette butt somewhere,
Right.
the overloaded electrical outlets,
Right.
boiler explosion,
Right.
all of these things.
Right.
And is the whole schmear of causes of fires at the time.
Right. So it is a mythology then that this was in fact an epidemic of arson. It was an epidemic of fires, but when we say arson, though, there's a popular belief that that's what it was, but in reality it was
not just a popular belief. It was
the official belief.
the narrative, the political narrative,
Okay.
the blame the victim
Right.
political narrative
Right. Right.
to cover a policy of ethnic cleansing against minority voting blocs, carried out through the withdrawal of essential services, the planned, targeted withdrawal of essential services from minority voting blocs. The context, by 1970, the civil rights movement had begun. By 1968, the civil rights movement had begun turning its attention north. You had Martin Luther King in Chicago. You had black mayors being elected in Newark, Cleveland, Detroit. You had in 1969, you had Herman Badillo making a credible run for mayor from a power base in the South Bronx. And you had, within the fire department, something called the Kirby Report. What happened between 1967 and 1968, fires went wild across the city. The fire service unions under the Flame Committee forced the city under binding arbitration to open some 16 fire companies in heavily overworked firehouses, second sections.
So let's explain that. So what they did basically is there were firehouses that had an existing fire company, but because there were so many calls for service, that actually created a second engine or a second ladder, basically, to cover all those calls that were coming from that very specific
That's right.
area.
And
basically.
if you go through, we have some visuals with this. If you go through indices of fire damage, what you see is that after 1968, when they opened the 16 fire companies, the second sections, the total damage began declining. Well, in 1970, the Deputy Chief Charles Kirby, working the Bronx, sent what became called the Kirby Report into John O'Hagan's office, in which he predicted the burnout of the Bronx in great detail. And the fire companies, he said, were essential to holding the line, were precisely the second sections that had been opened under binding arbitration. Subsequent to that, Deputy Chief Jonat in Brooklyn wrote a Jonat report about the impending burnout of Bushwick. You have the blacks and the Hispanics beginning to vote for their own candidates. You have the barbarians at the gate. And you have a tool for the exercise of power. And that tool was the New York City Rand Institute.
And that's leads me into my next question is, let's talk about Rand and who they are for the folks watching this. What was the Rand Institute, the Rand Corporation? How did it develop, the relationship to the war and things like that? And what were their goals basically, and how did they end up here in New York? So let's talk about some of those things.
All right. Well, New York City Rand Institute was created when John Lindsay adopted a policy to wean war firms away from war work and into civilian work. This was what he said he wanted to do. So he invited Rand to create the New York City Rand Institute. Rand was modeling the Indochina War at the time and faking the body counts. If everybody died who Rand said died in Vietnam, there wouldn't have been Vietnamese left. Anyway, so these things about how the models were faked and how the body counts were faked were revealed in the Pentagon Papers. Anyway, so that was one of the corporations that Lindsay invited in. His science advisor was John Dunning of Riverside Research Institute. Dunning had created the way of separating the two uranium isotopes to make the atom bomb. So, you know, these are hardcore war scientists and engineers. And those are the people that Lindsay invited into our government. So the New York City Rand Institute, the ostensible purpose was to help make the public services more efficient.
So efficiency was the baseline of the...
Efficiency
right.
was the baseline. And that's how this whole thing started.
And did they, and it wasn't just we're going to be talking about the fire department relationship to the Rand Institute, but there were other city agencies that perhaps were either involved or looking to be involved, right? So you want to talk about that briefly? What other kind of agencies?
They did try to get into the police department, but the police department, being what it is, put up a uniform front, and at that time, that methodology was just stymied. Both the union and the administrative staff were united in stopping Rand from doing what they later did in the fire department.
Right.
They did an analysis of rent control, and their recommendations went into the law that we greatly weakened rent control.
Okay, so it wasn't even, so we're going to be talking a lot about, of course, the fire-related issues, but in fact there were other areas we've just talked about,
Right.
both the attempts at moving into the police department's management structure, again, as a outside consultant, as well as issues of rent control and even health, too. Wasn't there some health-related things
They
looked
did
at?
something
They
on
tried.
ambulance.
Yeah.
Ambulances.
Ambulances.
Okay. So, but if I guess we could say, though, that the fire department ended up being the sort of repository for the majority of their, we'll call it
Yes.
efforts,
They
basically.
caved in first.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, something that it really is essential
Right.
is the fire department talks a lot about response time. In fact, the police talk about response time. The ambulance system talks about response time. For an ambulance, you have to get to where the call is, and then you have to take the person back to a hospital. So response time is very important.
Right.
For fire service, you've got a patient who can't move.
Right.
You have to build the hospital, the whole hospital, around the patient while the patient is getting sicker at an exponentially increasing rate in time. So the response time of the first responding unit is irrelevant. The question is, at what point in the growth of the fire have you built an adequate hospital around the patient? So you can't use response time. Of course, what RAND did, using operations research models, was not even model response time. What they modeled was response distance and made assumptions about what that distance meant in terms of the time of the first responding unit. For fire service, you have to look at the damage and the loss of life.
And you called that the damage index, right? That was part of your work. Was as you point out. So to just extend your point specifically about the hospital that you're creating at a fire scene, basically what you're saying is that it's not just the simplicity of like the first arriving fire unit as if they could handle everything, right? We're talking about literally having enough people, enough equipment, and the whole, essentially that whole package put together and operating to stop, in this case, the sickness or the impending death of someone. So it's right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I think for the people listening in on this,
Right.
we have to make it really clear about how fires behave.
Sure.
The individual fires usually start small. You know, fire on a stove, or someone's flicked cigarette, or a bad electrical plug. It starts small. Fires have an exponential growth, so there's a slow phase that then reaches a certain point and it grows very quickly.
Right.
This slow phase, though, can be pretty hot. And the organic materials around in the same room can actually start thermally decomposing before the fire goes into the exponential phase.
Right.
When it does that, when these materials start decomposing, they generate combustible gases. If those gases touch the flame, you get the flashover, the explosion, and a general involvement. So having a team there, the engines to put the water on the fire, the ladders to open the doors, to vent, to do the rescuing, they have to be there to work together quickly before you get something like that happening.
Right.
It's
Right.
really, really crucial.
Yeah,
Right.
and that teamwork had evolved over a 100-year period to deal with tenement fires in particular. And that teamwork is almost a ballet on the fire ground. It used to be 3 engines, 2 ladders. The engines would put water on the fire. The ladders would do rescue and venting, and the 3rd engine would stand fast for relief. And there were enough people on the engines so that you could stretch a hose to the 5th floor of a tenement, and the last guy would be fresh and be able to grab the hose and go into the burning apartment fresh. you needed that many men or women. And the details of how that was done is it's elegant. It's like a dance. It's also like a platoon in combat. It's also like a machine gun team. And you have to have enough people to feed the gun. And when you destaff fire companies, you don't have enough people to feed the gun.
Right. So there's a critical mass there that you need to perform the job that has to be done, basically, to stop the injury, as you say, or impending death. So this is, I think, an important issue here that, as we know even today, this issue of response time seems to be like, and the issue of response time, I guess, makes a lot of sense to the general public, that they think the speed and the quickness of getting there is like the predominant factor. But as you're pointing out, it's one factor, but the larger factor is actually getting those, again, sufficient number of people firefighters on the scene to actually intervene and stop what's happening, basically. You in your research, you came up with some measurements and some ways of putting metrics to what we're talking about. Specifically, you want to talk about your damage index a little bit and what that means. And you've got a graphic here.
Got a graphic here.
Right.
And what one does to make a damage index, there are many ways to do it. You can ask the responding chief to put a number on the fire report. Light, no damage, light, medium, heavy, extended to other buildings. That's one damage index. I worked for the FAIR plan, the low-income fire insurance program. We could make, with professional people on site, you could make an estimated dollar loss in fire damage. Or you could take the internal fire department response statistics. You could take number of structural fires, number of all-hands fires. Those are
fires where basically literally all hands are being used. Everyone's working.
Yeah,
Right.
1075.
Right.
You can take extra alarm assignments. So a 2-alarm fire is counted as 1 extra alarm assignment. A 5-alarm fire is 4 extra alarm assignments. You take them statistically. You do what's called a principal component analysis. You take the largest principal component, which is a volume measure, and you adjust it so that 0 fires gives a 0 index. And there's a third measure. We actually did that for disability retirements, and what we found was that for the 1970s, the fire index per 10,000 men predicted disability retirements very closely, and it was a dose-response curve.
Mm.
And at the high point, you were getting 10% of the force retiring into disability.
Onto disability, right.
At that point, the deficit in the pension fund went from 200 million to 1.2 billion. Yeah. That many men were forced out by the fire damage, injured.
Yeah, you can also look at civilian injuries and deaths. Mm-hmm. I made an index of annual number of fires that killed 5 people or more. Mm-hmm. And during the time when you had the second sections of the ladder companies, that number went down to 0. We had 2 years where there were no fires that killed 5 or more people. When they started eroding those ladder companies, it went right back up, and you were getting large numbers of people killed in these mass fatal fires.
Right.
So you can index property damage, you can index impact on public safety.
Right. You can look at the relation between all-hands fires and the rate of firefighter injuries.
Right.
Because you go into an all-hands fire, you're all out.
Right. Right.
You don't hold back.
Right.
and you do what you have to do to knock the fire down. And if there aren't enough people on the fire companies, if there aren't enough responding units, you just can't do it. You become a casualty. It's like going into combat with too few people in the platoon.
Right. Right.
That's an exact simile.
Right. And so I guess, this takes us to the next step, is to look a little deeper into we'll call it the RAND model, and the use of computers basically to, for all intents and purposes, was intended to inform decisions in the fire department, what have you. But of course, you found out that the RAND model was something much different than that. So you want to talk about the use of course, this is a big buzzword, algorithm. Everyone's using that word today, right? So let's talk about that a little bit, and how the RAND model evolved over several years, and literally what impact it had in the decision making in the fire department and the people involved. So that's a long
question.
That's a long question, but that sets the tone for, I think, where we need to go next.
Okay.
So
the first RAND model was called the resource allocation model.
Right.
And all it consisted of, it measured response time
Right.
of the first arriving engine.
Right.
It was a constant that depended on unit velocity,
Right.
which was arbitrarily assigned as 20 miles an hour. Okay?
Right. So we're talking about the speed of the apparatus to the call, which you just said is
Right.
which is uniformly assigned at 20 miles an hour, basically.
20 miles an hour.
Irregardless of the city, where it was, or time
Right,
of day, or anything.
Exactly.
Right.
So this was this constant that depended on this 20 miles an hour times the square root of the area of the hazard region
Right.
over the number of companies minus the non-available companies. And the non-available companies was also an estimate. It's not real.
Right.
So this was, they divided the city up into hazard regions. They assigned each region a hazard level.
Right.
They worked this response time model
Right.
so that within a hazard designation, the regions that had lower than average response time, those were the ones to lose.
Model calculated response time.
Those were the ones to lose a company. Now, that dictated the loss of companies for the 72 round and the 274 rounds of cuts. 75, they got more sophisticated.
It's 1975 we're talking about, yeah.
1975, they used the resource allocation model to identify the regions to lose the company.
Right.
But they had a new model, the firehouse siting model, to identify which company within those losing regions.
Right.
And that, again, it was just very, very simple. This time, though, for the firehouse siting model, they
Right.
said they had real data.
Okay.
But what the data was, they had the fire officers on 15 companies gauge the velocity, the acceleration to cruise velocity, and the distance to cruise velocity. Okay? 15 fire companies out of more than 350 or so. But it gets better. It was 13 ladders and 2 chief's cars, so there was no engine. Also, 11 of these 15 were in Manhattan below 14th Street. So all of the variability that we have in New York City of street
Traffic conditions.
traffic, parking, all of these things
Right.
did not go into this model.
Right.
And so those were the ways that companies were cut and are still cut.
Mm-hmm.
To this day. The Bloomberg administration cut companies and used these two models to do it.
I might interject one thing, because I was actually on that commission. I was there. And I'll have to say that I was appointed by the city council as one of the 2 representatives of the city council. And the first question, ironically, that I asked of the commission, which was composed of the fire commissioner, couple senior chiefs, 2 mayoral appointees, and then the 2 of us, the first question I asked them is, how do we not know we need to open 8 fire companies, let alone close 8 fire companies? How are we starting with closing 8 fire companies? And to tell you the truth, there was no answer to that because the decision had already been made. In the end, the other city council appointee, along with myself, voted against it. He was a former borough commander in Brooklyn. We voted against it. We felt a little bit better at the end of the day that we cut the 8 down to 6, arguing that in particular the one engine company that was on the list for closure was Engine 44, which I point out to them this is probably the highest density, high-rise residential area probably in the country, probably let alone the city. So, and of course, you talk about assembling your forces to put a fire out. It's one thing if the fire's on the first floor. It's another thing, of course, if the fire's on the 30th floor. So all those kind of issues did come up. And I have to tell you that, again, I did ask a question back then, where did the statistics come from as far as the ranking of companies? And it was in fact just simply response time. And I didn't get quite an answer exactly how those numbers were generated either. So anyway, I pointed out to you because it's something that what we're talking about right now sort of pops up over time again from time to time, and it's very important for people to understand the dynamics of how these decisions are made, right? And so anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just thought that this was an interesting aside here of what we're dealing with.
Now, what's interesting, you're knowledgeable. You're, fire scientist. Assemblyman, then City Councilman Vaca.
Right.
He held hearings on algorithms use in city government.
Right.
And he asked the fire department for the calculations,
right.
the RAND model and the calculations. They told him, you wouldn't understand them, so we're not going to give them to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So this is how these models are used, to take civil decisions out of the hands of the elected officials and out of the hands of the residents of the city.
Right, and so the issue of transparency, and I mean that's right, the basis of all inquiries, scientific inquiries, what have you, is to understand how it was built, right? How did we arrive at these numbers? How were the numbers collected? What numbers were we using, right? All those kind of things. So,
but there is another context.
Right.
The models, the RAND models, when you get into them, would not be allowed to determine policy for natural populations. The various ecosystem defense groups would intervene and say these models can't be used because they're too simple, they're too simplistic. But they were used on human populations, and the context for that was a legal decision some years ago. It's not enough to show that a policy is discriminatory. You have to show that the policy is deliberately discriminatory. If you've got a square root sign and some simple calculations, that's a legal shield against accusations of discrimination under the U.S. legal system. We raised the point that you could go in under environmental impact, use the environmental impact laws. But very curiously, the public officials to whom we raised this,
Sorry.
the public officials to whom we raised this issue never went forward with an environmental impact attack. There may be reasons why. They may have been felt that all they had to do was stand up and say, well, we're opposed to this, and then go on to the next issue. But the models are a legal shield.
Yeah, and they are, the way they work by looking at an area that has a lower than average response time, those are the areas where the second sections were put in
place, right?
for cause.
Right.
So the models guaranteed that areas of high density of fire companies were going to lose them.
Mm-hmm.
And so areas that needed fire service really badly were going to lose it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so this is for our listeners here. The model, the various versions of the models that were used by Rand, ultimately were the basis for making decisions on what fire companies to close in New York City, which we still, to this day in 2018, are still living with the impact of that, right? That those decisions were made back then. Of course, again, just remind our listeners here, too, that these decisions on what firehouses to keep or to close was being made at the same time when, again, the number of responses kept going up and up and up and up, particularly in the 70s. And so we had two really completely polar opposite, you've got this number of fires epidemic growing, and then at the same time we're closing firehouses. So that had a direct impact, again, in later years. We know that, would you agree that, again, I have to go back and look at the stats myself, but Manhattan particularly, and the Bronx paid probably, Manhattan, I guess you could say Manhattan in the 60s probably paid the biggest price. Would you say in the 70s was the Bronx and Brooklyn? I mean, that's kind of where, that would be the section, the boroughs of the city that had the most relationship to this in terms of, again, the fire volume going up as well as the companies being closed. The majority of them were in those two boroughs, right? In the Bronx and Brooklyn.
You lost Harlem and parts of the
Upper
Lower
Manhattan,
East Side.
right.
But Brooklyn was hit hard.
Right.
I mean, there were areas in Brooklyn that looked like the South Bronx or like parts of Harlem.
Right.
Just leveled.
Right.
Block after block.
Right. And so,
Bushwick, Brownsville, East New York. I remember once after the worst of it, I took a cab ride from downtown Brooklyn way out to East New York, and for an hour we drove through a devastated landscape. It was like the cities of Europe after World War II.
Right. And yet, again, today, as I said, the legacy still lives on with these models. I'm sure you both would agree that going forward, that this sort of set a marker out there, not just for New York City, but for the rest of the country, is that we're going to start using computer models then to help us make decisions, right? So, because, for example, I'm technical editor of Fire Engineering Magazine, and I know back in the 70s, I think there was a few articles basically that sort of moved beyond New York to talk about how the computer can help us solve problems, right? And so we want to talk about that. So let's talk about New York. We understand what happened in New York now and what the issues are here. But let's go a little bit further outside New York and think about, was this sort of perpetuated in other places? And
well, HUD got a hold of the models.
Right.
And there was another group like RAND called PTI, Public Technologies Incorporated.
Right.
And it had also this Euclidean type model.
Right.
Those models were sold to cities all over the country.
Right.
I mean, cities as diverse as Tacoma. In Washington, D.C., they were used for the ambulances. Tampa, Florida, Denver. Trenton. Yeah, a lot of cities took up those models one way or another. Mostly fire service, but sometimes ambulance.
Right, and there's a legacy of that out there today, not just in those cities, but in some of them, we'll call them standards or codes or regulations that are used. So let's talk about a few of them. So the Insurance Services Office, the ISO, Insurance Services Office, that's an organization that was created by the insurance industry to help determine the effectiveness of local fire departments, including their water supply and their communications and the type of buildings that they have and the staffing, of course, and things like that. So ISO, to this day, to some extent uses this response time model to a great extent. They've only actually recently, ironically, incorporated fire prevention enforcement into the model to see, again, because again, at the end of the day, what ISO is doing is trying to create a numerical system in which we can assess for an individual insurance company from a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the best, 10 being effectively people with buckets, that we can rate a fire department, and from there then we can decide how much insurance to charge to a person for their policies, basically. So we find elements of what you're talking about there, right? I mean, that's a place where you find it. How about the National Fire Protection Association now has a standard, actually 2 standards. The one perhaps that's more relevant here is NFPA 1710, which is effectively a deployment model standard for fire departments. And of course, at the end of the day, does use response time as a critical index, but to what Rodrick talked about earlier is that it does actually also have a limit on time to assembling all the forces, right? So they actually recognize that it's not just that the first engine gets there and everything's good, but in fact you need the full resources of an entire alarm assignment before you can say, okay, I have enough people. So what's ironic about that is that that was one of the things, of course, when I was on this commission, I brought up. I said, where do we fall into this national standard for response? And we really never got an answer to that. We asked that question, and I at the time, again, the fire department really wasn't collecting. They were collecting the data, but they really apparently weren't focused on even how they were sort of complying with that particular national standard for all fire departments. So do you want to talk about those two or any other sort of today's situation with this sort of where they sort of bubbled up from this set of RAM models up to where we are today, which is our sort of descendants of that? You want to talk a little bit about that too?
Well, certainly New York is a kind of national benchmark.
Right.
For people say, well, if these are the numbers for New York, we don't have to be that good.
Right.
At the number level of New York, the city burned down. Right. It looked like large parts of the city looked like Dresden after the fire bombings, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic bombing. That's the national standard. What we found was that indeed the burnout level was predictable in terms of the place. We were able to predict using data in the Bronx. We were able to predict the loss of population at the health area level. We could predict 90% of the variance. The essential index was the poverty level of the health area, which is a geographic subdivision, times the percent of badly overcrowded housing, more than 1.51 persons per room. And that number for each of the health areas, each geographic area, predicted the population loss, which in some health areas was 80 to 90%. Poverty has not improved in New York City. Because of the housing crisis, badly overcrowded housing is even worse than it was. After the burnout of the 70s, you had the South Bronx moving into the West Bronx. The people who were in the West Bronx evacuated. Same with when Bushwick Brownsville and East New York burned out. People moved down into Flatbush. The people who had been in Flatbush evacuated. That brought the badly overcrowded housing level below what would be called an epidemiological threshold, and the fires went down. Now everything has rewound. We have burnout levels of fire service and pre-burnout levels of the synergism between housing overcrowding and poverty. You can make a map of where it's going to go on the next round based on that, based on what I've said. Curiously, places like Harlem and parts of Sobro, the South Bronx, have been reoccupied by whites, or by people with money. who are, if not white, treated as white. So gentrification, the ethnic cleansing of the 1970s was successful. The rich people have moved into the previous neighborhoods, and there is some feeling that the fire service should be restored because the good people have moved into these neighborhoods, but everything is locked down by the RAND models because you can't admit what happened. If you go through the numbers, the application, the imposition of the RAND models and the burnout, you get something like a back-of-the-envelope calculation for 100,000 premature mortalities over a 30-year period as a consequence of the burnout. You can't admit that happened, so you can't put the fire companies back in the newly gentrified neighborhoods. So that this is a problem for City Hall. How that problem is going to be resolved remains to be seen. But certainly nationally, New York is, we do it the way they do it in New York. You do it the way you do it in New York, and you're going to have a lot of premature mortalities.
Right, and so we talk about, we got a little time left here, so we could talk about planning, strategic planning in the fire department, strategic planning citywide, that, as you know, building a firehouse is not done overnight. You can create fire companies, but to place them does take some thought and some rigor and, of course, money to do that. And so we could argue that, as the city moves forward, particularly, as more and more people are moving into the city, and of course, we're getting people moving into neighborhoods now that were something different before what they are now, particularly in Brooklyn and places like that, that we've got to rethink about our fire service deployment. We've got to think about the type of buildings that folks are moving into. We need to talk about the type of fire protection we provide for buildings, That's important as well. If we have a building that's fully sprinkled, the fire department plays much more of a mop-up role for the most part in a fully sprinkled building, because we know that statistically there's a very little chance of dying in a fully sprinkled building in a fire. So it's part of a much larger scheme of things, but I don't think, again, I'm just putting my own editorial comment on this. Just having watched this myself for a while, I don't think we're quite there yet in New York, where we are actually thinking about the issue of firehouse locations, fire company locations, the size of the fire department, the type of fire department. We really have come to full grasp with, in my opinion, with this at this point, that we don't consider a lot of different factors, and we're sort of still to some extent stuck in this RAM model sort of approach to dealing with these kind of situations and things. And again, that's just my own 2 cents on where we are with this. Since again we've got a few minutes, it's something that's just a little bit off, not quite off. It's certainly related directly to the topic, but since I've got you sitting here, Deborah, I can't miss not asking you about the incredible book that you did in the 70s on plastics and combustibility and things like that. We have to talk about that because there aren't a lot of videos you talking about this, so that's why I'm going to ask you a little bit about that. That at the same time, the issues we're talking about now, the issue of the toxicity of burning plastics sort of started to emerge. We had, for example, fire in Kentucky in the late 70s at the Southgate, Kentucky, at the Beverly Hills Supper Club.
I was an expert witness on that.
Yes, exactly, where the interior finish played a role there in that fire, and other kinds of issues there as well. And so you saw this coming down the pike, I would imagine. You saw that there's something more to smoke than really meets the eye here in terms of toxicity and things. So you want to just take a couple minutes to talk about your book, In the Mouth of the Dragon, because it again is
it's toxic fires in the age of plastics.
Right.
Yes, the traditional materials, they're built under a biological budget, so the energy levels per volume are low. It takes a lot of heat to get them to burn. It takes almost as much heat to get them to start decomposing, okay? Plastics are a different story. someone I know called them solid gasoline. Anyway, the carbon atoms are very dense in plastic, and you have a lot of energy locked in there. So once you start heating them and you get that energy released, you get a very rapid fire growth. Also, because of the high energy situation, they start to decompose. The bonds burst very quickly. In something like polyvinyl chloride, which is an extremely common cheap plastic, you can get unhydrated hydrochloric acid coming off in clouds long before any flames appear.
Right.
So the decomposition temperature for many plastics is much lower than the ignition temperature.
Right.
And that you have no warning then.
Right.
All of a sudden, you're breathing in this stuff.
Right.
For foam.
Right. Polyurethane.
Polyurethane foam. That will start decomposing with organic stuff, which generates a lot of combustible gases. So
More carbon.
Your potential for flashover is very high when you get that.
And
Once it starts burning, though,
right.
it's not just carbon monoxide coming off and, little bits of organics. You're getting cyanide coming
Hydrogen
off.
cyanide, right?
Hydrogen cyanide coming off, and it interacts with the carbon monoxide to have like doubling occupation of hemoglobin, and you cannot get oxygen on the hemoglobin then.
Right. Right.
And it's a lot more tenacious to the hemoglobin than carbon monoxide.
Which itself has its own great affinity for oxygen, right? So.
Right. So these are poisons that are generated by plastics in fires that neither firefighters nor civilians were very aware of when these things came out. And I don't think they're aware of them yet.
Right.
Really.
Right, because this is, we talk about, again, response time. We talk about the forces that we bring to the fire scene. We're talking about fires that the growth patterns are much different, perhaps, than they were, let's say, around the Second World War, for example. And it's same apartment building, same everything. The contents, though, of course, for a fire plays a big role here. And, of course, again, we're talking about velocity here in terms of the spread of a fire and the development of the fire, in terms of heat release rates and things like that. So as we were talking earlier, again, about the need for having a sufficient number of firefighters with a sufficient number of equipment, in that dance that Rodrick talked about of coordinated efforts to do all these things to put an end to this problem, that the problem we have today is that that we keep falling further and further behind in terms of our ability to sort of respond to that. Right.
When you get huge quantities of plastics involved in fire, that's an extreme danger to the firefighters. The New York telephone fire involved tons and tons of polyvinyl chloride.
1975, right. And it was basically in a switching station, which was loaded, of course, with plastic-coated wires, basically.
Right. What happened to those firefighters was the smoke that is generated is extremely black.
Right. Lots of carbon.
Well, it's not just lots of carbon. The chlorine prevents complete combustion.
Right.
So you're getting a lot of soot coming off that is not combusted.
Right.
A lot of, instead of going off as carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide, it's coming off as soot, a lot of it.
Right.
So they went in there, they couldn't see.
Right.
They spent a long time trying to find the fire, and their air packs ran out. So they ended up exposed to this tremendously irritating smoke and fumes.
Right, their air tanks ran out basically, and then they were exposed to these fumes.
And they were exposed to that fume, and like huge numbers of them ended up in the hospital needing medical care. And a lot of them ended up with permanent injuries.
Well, a lot of cancer.
Well, it's not just that.
Right.
It,
It-
respiratory
respiratory
injury.
issues. Right.
Right.
Right. So that is a significant fire here in New York City, particularly. But again, it's in the same time period we're talking about New York City and these fire companies. So there's a lot of things happening here. Right. Right.
So,
Exactly.
I just say one thing. Now, as a result of the plastics level that firefighters face, you have the bunker gear. Everybody has bunker gear, which is heavy.
Right.
Everybody has super heavy breathing equipment.
Right.
Yet you have the same depleted number of people on the companies.
Right.
So
Right.
you're running up to the top floor
Right.
of the tenement,
Right.
but there are fewer of you as there were in the 70s, but you're weighted down by your protective equipment. They should be adding even more firefighters because of the current toxic load
Right.
in most of the fires.
Right.
They're not.
Right.
They're saving money.
Right. Right. And so of
At
course
least that's what they say they're doing.
Right.
It's
right. This
not clear what they're doing at this point. Certainly, Bloomberg wanted to close 20 fire companies in 2011. You know the neighborhoods where he would have closed them, and you know why he would have chosen those neighborhoods. So the idea apparently was to continue the ethnic cleansing of the 1970s after 2000, but Bloomberg isn't with us, but his legacy is with us.
And so, to sort of summarize what we've talked about here today, that just what you said, Robert, that we'll call it the science in quotes, that was brought to the city here to make our fire department, again, and put in quotes, more effective, efficient, what have you, by the use of computer models, algorithms, things like that. That legacy continues with us to this day. Basically, that we're still, to a great extent, making decisions about, again, locations. Not even so much the locations of fire companies, but closing of fire companies and things like that. We would hope that going forward that these lessons, again, for example, with today's podcast here, that folks will appreciate how much thought really needs to go into to thinking about firehouse locations, number of firefighters, equipment, all those kind of things. It's not just it's not as simplistic, perhaps, as what we wanted to think about. So go ahead.
There's something really important here. Under Bloomberg, the city adopted the model building code.
Right.
That stripped out a lot of the safeguards from the old New York building code.
Right.
And that doesn't make anything any better.
Right. So that's why I stated earlier that we can study the fire department itself, but it's in this other context of what else is going on in terms of the built environment. We know that we've had, again, a number of recent fires in the last year with multiple fatalities in older buildings, of course, that, really old buildings that are 100 years old, that had very little fire protection in them. So the regulations in terms of construction have to meet up with whatever you're throwing at them in terms of firefighting. So if you're going to reduce your firefighting forces, then you've got to build up your built-in protection, perhaps, and that's an area that many of us have argued about for a long time, and it's got to be looked at holistically here. So any final comments from the two of you on this segment of our
Well, I'll just say the mantra of the 1970s was operations research is going to free you. As Malcolm X once put it, the names have changed, but the game's the same. Now the mantra is artificial intelligence is going to free you. So they've gone from one line of techno bullshit to another line of techno bullshit. And we're left holding a bag full of
that stuff. Deborah, do you want to any last comments for the listeners here?
Well, I want to make a final peroration about the outfall of the fire epidemic. It was fire and building abandonment epidemic, because when the buildings had a lot of fire damage, the landlords couldn't repair economically, and they walked. And once you got the landlords walking,
Abandoning.
then you had this mix of landlords abandoning, new fires coming up, and all of that. It spread.
Right.
Public health was dealt a huge blow then. We had the tuberculosis epidemic. We had people going on drugs that would not have otherwise because their families were all scattered, their friends were all scattered, their social fabric was gone. There was no support, no
The neighborhood was lost. Right?
no control.
Right.
So we had the drugs and the violence and sexual adventuring, and that got into the AIDS epidemic. So we even had a situation where certain neighborhoods were so disorganized that information about vaccinating your children was not getting out, and we had the 86 measles epidemic and the 1990 measles epidemic. Having a stable neighborhood is absolutely necessary for public health.
Right. Well, thank you very much. And I think we'll be taping another segment today, and I think you're going to talk about that even in more detail.
Okay.
So I want to thank you both for coming along with us today on this podcast. And again, as I opened up here, the both of you are world renowned in the work that you've done. You've set a high standard for everyone, and here at John Jay, we appreciate all the work that you did way back when.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting us.